Wyoming Territory, October 1885. The autumn wind cut through Cedar Ridge like a knife, carrying with it the scent of dust and desperation. Jack Mackenzie pulled his worn leather coat tighter as he dismounted from his horse, the familiar creak of the saddle mixing with the murmur of voices from the town square. He hadn't planned to attend the auction. Such spectacles left a bitter taste in his mouth, but business had brought him to town, and curiosity had proven stronger than his distaste. The crowd gathered around the makeshift platform was typical of frontier settlements. Ranchers with calloused hands and sun-weathered faces, merchants in their slightly cleaner clothes, and the usual collection of drifters and opportunists. Jack recognized most of them, though few would call him friend. 10 years of ranching alone had earned him respect, but little warmth from his neighbors. "Next item," called out Samuel Morrison, the town's self-appointed auctioneer, his voice carrying over the scattered conversations. Elena Vasquez, 19 years old, strong constitution despite her condition. Jack's attention snapped to the platform, where a young woman stood with her chin raised defiantly, dark eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Her simple brown dress couldn't hide her advanced pregnancy, and despite the circumstances, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to challenge every person in the crowd. Her black hair, partially escaped from its braid, whipped around her face in the wind. "She's been nothing but trouble since she arrived," Morrison continued, his tone suggesting he was eager to be rid of her. "Wild as a Mustang and twice as stubborn. But she's young, and the child she carries might prove useful in time." Jack felt his jaw clench at the casual cruelty in the man's words. Around him, potential buyers examined Eleanor like livestock, some making crude comments about her appearance or speculating about the father of her child. The young woman's eyes swept over them with undisguised contempt, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. "Do I hear $20? Morrison called out. 15, came a rough voice from Jack's left. He turned to see Pete Hawkins, a rancher known for his harsh treatment of workers. "Might be worth something once she drops that burden." Elena's eyes flashed dangerously at the comment, and Jack saw her hands clench into fists. Even from his position at the back of the crowd, he could sense the fury radiating from her small frame. 20, called another voice. 25, Hawkins countered, his grin revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Jack found himself studying the woman more closely. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of the wild horses he occasionally found on his land, beautiful, proud, and utterly untamed. She was clearly Mexican or perhaps part Spanish, her olive skin and fine features speaking of heritage that likely made her an outsider in this predominantly Anglo settlement. "Do I hear 30? Morrison's voice grew more animated as the price climbed. Jack watched as Elena's gaze swept over her potential buyers, her expression growing more desperate despite her attempts to maintain her composure. When her eyes briefly met his across the crowd, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Fear, carefully hidden beneath layers of defiance but unmistakably present. 35, Hawkins called out, his enthusiasm growing. Without fully understanding why, Jack found himself stepping forward. $50, he called out, his deep voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. Conversations died as heads turned toward him. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, though whether in hope or suspicion he couldn't tell. Hawkins scowled in his direction, clearly annoyed by the sudden competition. 55, Hawkins shot back. 75, Jack replied without hesitation, his tone calm but final. The crowd fell silent. $75 was more than many of these men made in several months. Hawkins opened his mouth as if to counter, then seemed to think better of it, stepping back with a muttered curse. 75 going once, Morrison called out, scanning the crowd hopefully. Going twice. His gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to Jack Mackenzie. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack approached the platform where Eleanor stood, her dark eyes now fixed on him with a mixture of wariness and calculation. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the way she favored her left side as if nursing some hidden injury. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, ignoring Morrison's attempts to hand him papers he had no intention of signing. "Elena," she replied, her accent coloring the name with musical tones. "Elena Vasquez." Her voice was stronger than he'd expected, carrying a slight rasp that suggested she'd done her share of shouting or screaming. "I'm Jack Mackenzie. I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here." He paused, uncertain how to proceed. You're free to leave whenever you choose. I won't force you to stay." Her eyes narrowed, as if she were trying to determine whether this was some elaborate trap. "Then why did you buy me?" It was a fair question, and one Jack wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because no one else should have that power over another person," he said finally. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dusty town square, two souls from different worlds, both carrying invisible wounds. Finally, Elena nodded slowly. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her pride clearly struggling with the confession. "Not until the baby comes," Jack finished gently. "See." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "The child needs a safe place to be born." Jack nodded, understanding more than she realized. "My ranch can provide that." "But Elena," he paused until she met his eyes again, "you're not my property. You're a guest for as long as you need to be." Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in her armor of suspicion. Chapter 2. The Long Road Home. October 1885. The wagon ride to Jack's ranch stretched before them like a test of endurance, the rutted dirt road winding through vast expanses of golden prairie grass that swayed hypnotically in the afternoon wind. Elena sat rigidly beside Jack on the wooden bench, her hands gripping the seat as each bump and jolt sent uncomfortable waves through her swollen body. She had refused his offer of blankets and cushions with a sharp shake of her head, determined not to show any sign of weakness to this stranger, who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, paid $75 for her freedom. Jack guided the horses with practiced ease, his weathered hands steady on the reins. The silence between them had stretched for nearly an hour, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. He stole occasional glances at his passenger, noting the way she held herself apart from him, the careful distance she maintained even on the narrow bench. "The baby," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the wind. "When is it due?" Elena's jaw tightened. "Soon," she replied curtly, offering no elaboration. "A month? 2 months?" She turned to study his profile, searching for signs of the ulterior motives she was certain he must harbor. Men didn't spend that kind of money without expecting something in return. "Why does it matter to you?" Jack was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I want to make sure there's a doctor available when the time comes. Doc Peterson in Cedar Ridge is reliable, but if the weather turns bad, it might be difficult to get him out to the ranch." "I don't need a doctor," Elena said quickly. "I've helped birth babies before. I know what to do." "That's not the same as having help when you need it." The gentleness in his tone unsettled her more than harsh words would have. She had learned to navigate cruelty and aggression, but kindness was foreign territory, dangerous in its own way. "I can take care of myself." "I always have." Jack nodded slowly, as if he understood something she hadn't said aloud. "I'm sure you can, but everyone needs help sometimes." Elena fell silent, turning her attention to the landscape rolling past them. The Wyoming territory was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, endless sky that seemed to swallow the horizon, mountains rising like sleeping giants in the distance, and grass that whispered secrets she couldn't understand. It was so different from the crowded, dusty streets where she'd spent the last month scraping together survival. "How long have you been alone out here?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. 10 years, give or take." Jack's response was matter of fact, but she caught something beneath the surface, a carefully controlled loneliness that reminded her of her own. "No wife? No family?" "No." The single word carried weight, and Elena sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. She had her own secrets to guard. As they created a small rise, the ranch came into view below them. Elena had expected something primitive, a single shack perhaps, or a rough cabin. Instead, she saw a well-maintained 2-story house with a wraparound porch, flanked by a sturdy barn and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting warmth and comfort within. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Most of it. Had help with the barn raising and a few other projects." Jack's voice carried a note of quiet pride. "It's not much, but it's home." As they drew closer, Eleanor could see the care that had gone into every detail. The fence posts were straight and strong. The garden plot beside the house showed signs of recent harvest, and even the chicken coop was built with obvious attention to both function and appearance. This was the home of a man who took pride in his work, who built things to last. Jack brought the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down, moving around to offer Elena his hand. She stared at it for a moment, then carefully lowered herself from the wagon without assistance. The movement sent a sharp pain through her lower back, and she couldn't quite suppress a small gasp. "You're hurt," Jack observed, his eyes immediately focusing on the way she held herself. "Just tired," Elena lied, though the pain was becoming more frequent and intense as her pregnancy progressed. Jack studied her for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "The front bedroom is on the ground floor. It gets good light and stays warm. You can rest there." "I don't need charity," Eleanor said sharply, her pride flaring despite her exhaustion. "It's not charity, it's practical. A woman in your condition shouldn't be climbing stairs unnecessarily." The way he said it, matter of fact without pity or judgment, made it easier for her to accept. Eleanor nodded once, a curt acknowledgement that felt safer than gratitude. Jack led her up the porch steps and through the front door into a home that took her breath away. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and shelves lined with books suggested an educated man despite his rough exterior. Everything was clean and well maintained, a sharp contrast to the squalid conditions she'd grown accustomed to. "The bedroom is through here," Jack said, leading her down a short hallway. The room he showed her was larger than any space she'd called her own in months. A sturdy bed with clean linens dominated the space, and a washstand with fresh water and towels waited near the window. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, and the smell of soap and lavender filled the air. Elena stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of it all. "Why?" she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. Jack turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "Because everyone deserves a safe place to rest. Because you're carrying a child who needs protecting. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." For the first time since he'd bought her freedom, Eleanor felt something crack in her defensive walls. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility that this man might actually be what he appeared to be. The thought terrified her more than any threat could have. "I'll earn my keep," she said firmly, needing to establish some sense of control. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I won't be a burden." Jack shook his head. "You're not a burden, Elena. You're a guest. Rest now. We can talk about everything else later." As he turned to leave, giving her the privacy she so desperately needed, Elena felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally threaten to fall. She waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before sinking onto the edge of the bed, her hands cradling her belly as she tried to process this unexpected turn in her fortunes. Outside her window, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had finally found a place where she could catch her breath. Chapter 3. Walls and Bridges, November 1885. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's arrival at the Mackenzie Ranch, and the first snows of winter had begun to dust the Wyoming landscape with crystalline white. From her bedroom window, she watched Jack working in the barn, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air as he tended to the horses. Despite his insistence that she was a guest, Eleanor had steadily assumed more responsibilities around the house, driven by a need to contribute that went deeper than mere gratitude. The kitchen had become her domain, where she prepared meals that filled the house with aromas Jack hadn't experienced in years. Her cooking carried the flavors of her heritage, spices and techniques passed down through generations, transforming his simple pantry staples into dishes that made him linger at the table long after he'd finished eating. This morning, however, Eleanor moved more slowly than usual, one hand pressed against her lower back as she kneaded bread dough. The baby had been increasingly active during the night, and the familiar ache that had plagued her for weeks was growing stronger. She paused in her work, breathing deeply as a wave of discomfort washed over her. "You should be resting," Jack's voice came from the kitchen doorway, startling her. Eleanor straightened quickly, masking her discomfort with practiced ease. "The bread won't bake itself," she replied, returning to her kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. Jack stepped into the kitchen, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Over the past weeks, they had developed a careful routine of coexistence, polite conversations over meals, shared tasks that required minimal interaction, and a mutual respect for each other's privacy. Yet Elena remained an enigma to him, guarded and self-sufficient in ways that both impressed and concerned him. "Elena," he said gently, "you don't have to prove anything to me." Her hands stilled on the dough. "What do you mean?" "I mean you work from dawn to dusk, never ask for help, never complain. You act like you're afraid I'll throw you out if you're not useful every moment." Elena's jaw tightened. "Wouldn't you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of her past experiences. Jack moved closer, stopping just outside her personal space, a boundary he'd learned to respect over their weeks together. "No," he said simply, "I wouldn't." She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception. "Men always want something in return, Jack. Always. I've learned that the hard way." What did he want? The question escaped before Jack could stop it, and he immediately saw Elena's walls slam back into place. "Who?" she asked, though they both knew exactly who he meant. "The father of your baby." Elena's hands moved protectively to her belly, a gesture that had become second nature. For a moment Jack thought she might answer, might finally share some piece of the story that had brought her to that auction block. Instead, she turned back to her bread dough. "That's not your concern," she said quietly. Jack nodded, recognizing the finality in her tone. "You're right. I'm sorry." The apology seemed to surprise her. She glanced at him over her shoulder, and for just a moment, her expression softened. "He wanted me to be someone I wasn't," she said finally, the words barely audible. "Someone quiet and grateful and small. And you're none of those things," Jack observed, not as criticism, but as simple fact. "No," Elena agreed, lifting her chin with familiar defiance. "I'm not." "Good," Jack said, surprising her again. "The world has enough quiet, grateful, small people. It needs more women like you." Before Elena could respond, a sharp pain seized her, different from the dull ache she'd grown accustomed to. She gasped, doubling over as her hands flew to her belly. "Elena!" Jack was beside her in an instant, his strong hands steadying her as another wave of pain followed the first. It's too early," she panted, fear creeping into her voice for the first time since he'd known her. Jack's mind raced, calculating distances and weather conditions. The road to town was already treacherous with ice, and the storm clouds gathering on the horizon promised more snow before nightfall. How early? A month, maybe more. Elena's breathing was becoming labored as the contractions intensified. "This can't be happening, not yet." Jack swept her into his arms, ignoring her weak protests as he carried her to the bedroom. "Sometimes babies make their own schedule," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his own mounting concern. As he settled her on the bed, Elena gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Jack, if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," he interrupted firmly. "But if it does," she persisted, her eyes boring into his, "promise me you'll take care of the baby. Promise me you won't let them take my child to some orphanage where—" "Elena, stop!" Jack's voice was gentle but insistent. "You're going to be fine, both of you." Another contraction seized her, stronger than the last, and Elena bit back a cry. When it passed, she looked up at him with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission costing her greatly. Jack brushed a strand of dark hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. "I know, but you're the strongest person I've ever met. If anyone can do this, it's you." "Will you—" she began, then stopped, struggling with the words. "Will I what? Will you stay with me? I know it's not proper, but I don't want to be alone." Jack's throat tightened at her vulnerability, so different from the fierce independence she usually displayed. "I'll stay as long as you need me to." As if in response to his promise, another contraction gripped Elena, and Jack realized that, ready or not, this baby was determined to make its entrance into the world. The storm outside was picking up, wind howling around the house like a living thing. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, a different kind of storm was beginning, one that would change both their lives forever. Eleanor reached for his hand as the next wave of pain began, and Jack held on tight, silently vowing that whatever happened in the hours ahead, she wouldn't face it alone. Cowboy Chapter 4. Into the storm November 1885. The blizzard arrived with the baby. Snow lashed against the windows as Elena labored through the longest night of her life, each contraction a testament to both her strength and her stubborn refusal to surrender to fear. Jack had never felt more helpless or more determined, moving between stoking the fire, boiling water, and providing whatever comfort he could to the woman who had transformed his solitary existence in just 3 weeks. "The snow's getting worse," he reported after checking the windows for the dozenth time. "Even if I could make it to town, I'd never get Doc Peterson back here tonight." Elena, propped against pillows he'd arranged behind her, managed a weak smile between contractions. "Then it's just us," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "like everything else has been." The observation struck Jack with unexpected force. She was right. They had become a team of sorts, two solitary souls learning to share space and responsibility. Now they were about to face the ultimate test of that partnership. "Tell me what you need," he said, settling beside the bed with a basin of warm water and clean towels. "My grandmother," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising them both. "She delivered half the babies in our village. She used to say that birth was like a storm. You couldn't stop it or control it. You could only move with it and trust that it would pass." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Elena's expression grew distant. "She said that every baby chooses its moment to come into the world, and that moment is always exactly when it's supposed to be, even if we don't understand why." Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, and Elena gripped Jack's hand with surprising force. He felt something shift in that moment, not just in her body as the baby moved into position, but in the careful distance they had maintained between themselves. Here, in this raw and primal moment, pretense fell away like shed clothing. "I can see the head," Jack said, wonder and terror mingling in his voice. "Elena, the baby's coming." "I know," she panted, bearing down with all her remaining strength. "I can feel—" Her words dissolved into a cry of effort that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. Jack found himself coaching her through each push, his voice steady and encouraging even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "That's it, you're doing beautifully. Just a little more." With a final, tremendous effort that left Elena sobbing with exhaustion and relief, the baby slipped into Jack's waiting hands. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the storm raging outside. Then, as if offended by the sudden quiet, the infant let out a lusty wail that filled the house with new life. "It's a girl," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he carefully cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft blankets Elena had prepared weeks ago. "She's perfect." Eleanor struggled to sit up, her arms reaching eagerly for her daughter. When Jack placed the baby in her arms, the transformation on her face was complete. The guarded, defensive woman he'd known disappeared, replaced by someone radiant with fierce maternal love. "Mija," she whispered, the Spanish endearment flowing naturally as she studied the tiny face. "My little warrior. You couldn't wait, could you?" The baby's cries settled into soft, mewling sounds as she found her mother's warmth. Jack watched the scene with something approaching awe, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment yet unable to look away. "She's beautiful," he said softly, "just like her mother." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for staying, for helping, for what? For making me feel safe enough to let her come into the world." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond the night's events. Jack reached out almost unconsciously, his calloused finger gently stroking the baby's downy cheek. "What will you call her?" he asked. Eleanor considered for a moment, looking from her daughter to the man who had helped bring her safely into the world. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." As if approving of her choice, the baby settled more deeply into sleep, a tiny fist curled against her mother's breast. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the circle of lamplight, peace reigned. Jack found himself studying this new version of Elena, softer somehow, but not weaker. If anything, holding her daughter seemed to have completed something in her, filling in missing pieces he hadn't even realized were absent. "She'll need a birth certificate," he said practically, though his mind was working on deeper levels. "Official papers." "Yes," Elena agreed, then looked at him with sudden uncertainty. "Jack, what happens now? I know you didn't expect—" "This changes everything." He was quiet for a long moment, considering her question and all its implications. The arrival of baby Hope had indeed changed everything, but perhaps not in the ways Eleanor feared. "What changes?" he asked finally. "You needed a safe place to have your baby. Now you have a safe place to raise her." "You can't mean that. A baby changes everything. The noise, the work, the responsibility." "Elena," Jack interrupted gently, "do you want to stay?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on expecting rejection that the possibility of choice hadn't occurred to her. She began, then stopped, looking down at her sleeping daughter. Yes, she whispered. If you'll have us, yes. Jack nodded as if the matter were settled, but Eleanor caught something in his expression, a vulnerability that matched her own. What about you? She asked softly. Do you want us to stay? For the first time since she'd known him, Jack Mackenzie smiled, really smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and reaching his eyes. More than I knew was possible, he admitted. As dawn broke over the Wyoming landscape, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of pink and gold, three souls who had been strangers just weeks before began the delicate process of becoming a family. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, clean, white, and full of new possibilities. Chapter 5. Hearts Untamed, Spring 1886. The Wyoming spring arrived with a symphony of melting snow and returning life, transforming the ranch from its winter cocoon into a landscape of emerging green and endless possibility. 5 months had passed since Hope's dramatic entrance into the world, and the tiny cabin that had once echoed with solitary footsteps now rang with the sounds of family. A baby's laughter, Elena's singing as she worked, and the deeper rumble of Jack's voice as he spoke to his daughter in the gentle tones reserved only for her. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching Jack in the corral with a wild Mustang he'd been patiently training for weeks. The horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with fire in her eyes, had been captured during the winter roundup, untamed, suspicious, and fighting every attempt at domestication. Eleanor saw something of herself in the animal's stubborn independence. She's beautiful, Eleanor murmured, shifting baby Hope to her other hip as the infant babbled contentedly, her bright eyes following her mother's gaze to the man in the corral. Jack moved with infinite patience around the mare, never forcing, never demanding, simply presenting himself as a constant, unthreatening presence. It was the same approach he had taken with Eleanor herself, she realized, offering safety and respect while waiting for trust to develop naturally. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Elena's attention to the road, where a familiar figure was riding toward the ranch. Doc Peterson, his medical bag secured behind his saddle, had become a regular visitor since Hope's birth, ostensibly to check on the baby's development, but really, Elena suspected, because he enjoyed the company and her coffee. "Morning, Elena," Doc Peterson called as he dismounted near the porch. "How's our little miracle today?" "Growing too fast," Elena replied, stepping outside to greet him. Hope immediately reached for the doctor, who had become one of her favorite people during his regular visits. "And how's her mama?" Doc asked with the gentle concern that had made him beloved throughout the territory. "Strong," Eleanor answered automatically, then caught his knowing look. "Tired sometimes, but strong." Doc Peterson had delivered enough babies to recognize the signs of a woman still adjusting to motherhood, especially one doing it largely alone, despite the presence of a devoted partner. He had watched the careful dance between Elena and Jack over the months, two people clearly drawn to each other, but held apart by invisible barriers. "Jack's doing well with that mare," Doc observed, nodding toward the corral where the Mustang was now allowing Jack to approach within arm's length. "He has patience with wild things," Eleanor said softly, unconsciously echoing her own journey from suspicion to acceptance. "Some things are worth the wait," Doc replied meaningfully. "Some people, too." Before Eleanor could respond, Jack appeared at the corral fence, having noticed their visitor. "Doc, good to see you. How are things in town?" "Busy as always," Doc replied, walking over to examine his progress with the mare. "She's coming along nicely. What will you call her?" Jack glanced at Eleanor, who was following with Hope in her arms. "Haven't decided yet. Elena, what do you think? You've been watching her longer than anyone." Elena studied the mare, noting the proud arch of her neck and the intelligence in her dark eyes. "Esperanza," she said finally. "It means hope in Spanish." "Like your daughter's name," Doc observed with approval. "Yes," Elena said, her eyes meeting Jack's across the corral fence. "Hope for what could be, if we're brave enough to reach for it." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Over the past months, they had grown from strangers to partners, to something deeper and more complex that neither had quite dared to name. Jack had become not just a provider, but a true father to Hope, rising in the night to walk her when she was fussy, singing off-key lullabies that never failed to make her smile, teaching her to recognize the sounds of the ranch that would be her world. Elena, in turn, had transformed the house from a mere shelter into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the countless small touches that spoke of permanence and care. But between the two adults remained a careful distance, a mutual respect that had never quite blossomed into the intimacy their hearts yearned for. "I should check on Hope," Doc said, tactfully interrupting the charged moment. "Make sure she's meeting all her milestones." As Doc Peterson conducted his examination on the porch, pronouncing Hope healthy and thriving, Eleanor found herself watching Jack work with Esperanza. The mare had allowed him to slip a halter over her head, a significant breakthrough that spoke to weeks of patient trust-building. "You're good with her," Eleanor said, as Jack approached the fence, his shirt damp with perspiration, despite the cool spring air. "She reminds me of someone I know," he replied with a small smile. "Beautiful, intelligent, and determined not to let anyone get too close." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the comparison. "I'm not afraid of getting close," she protested, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. "Aren't you?" Jack's voice was gentle, without accusation. "We've been living in the same house for 6 months, raising a child together, sharing meals and conversations, and—" He paused, searching for words. "And we're still strangers in the ways that matter most." The truth of his observation hit Elena like a physical blow. They were partners, co-parents, friends even, but they had never spoken of feelings, never acknowledged the current of attraction that ran between them like an underground river. "I don't know how," she admitted quietly, bouncing Hope gently as the baby began to fuss. "To trust someone with everything. My body, my heart, my future. I gave all of that to someone once, and he used it to try to control me, to diminish me." Jack moved closer, his calloused hand reaching out to stroke Hope's cheek. "I would never try to control you, Eleanor. Your fire, your independence, your strength, those are the things I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with his own vulnerability. "The things you what?" Elena whispered. "The things I love about you," he finished, the words emerging quietly, but with unmistakable conviction. Elena's breath caught in her throat. In all their months together, neither had spoken the word that seemed to hover constantly in the air between them. "Jack, I know it's complicated," he continued, his eyes searching her face. "I know you're not ready and I won't push. But I needed you to know that what I feel for you, it's not possession or control, it's admiration, it's respect, it's love for exactly who you are, not who I might want you to become." Tears Elena had been holding back for months finally spilled over. "I'm so afraid," she whispered, "of trusting again, of believing that this could really last, of letting Hope get too attached if I leave." Jack shook his head firmly. "Eleanor, I'm not going anywhere. This ranch, this life we've built, it's not complete without you and Hope. You're not guests here anymore, you're home." The word home broke something loose in Elena's chest, some final barrier she had maintained against complete surrender to the life they had created together. She looked into Jack's eyes and saw not the calculating desire she had learned to fear in men, but genuine love, patient, respectful, and absolutely unwavering. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I love how gentle you are with Hope, how you never try to make me smaller than I am, how you see strength where others see stubbornness." Jack's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Does this mean you're ready to stop being afraid?" Elena looked around at the ranch that had become their sanctuary, at the house where Hope had been born, at the corral where Esperanza was learning to trust, at the man who had given them both a place to be exactly who they were. "I'm ready to try," she said, then rose on her toes to brush her lips against his in their first real kiss. As spring bloomed around them and their daughter gurgled happily in her mother's arms, Elena Vasquez and Jack Mackenzie finally acknowledged what their hearts had known for months, that some storms bring destruction, but others bring exactly what we need, even if we don't recognize it at first. In the corral, Esperanza nickered softly, as if approving of this new chapter in the story of the untamed hearts that had found their way home to each other. Territories, epilogue. 1 year later, the wedding was small, just Doc Peterson officiating, a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses, and baby Hope tottering between her parents on unsteady legs, babbling in a mixture of English and Spanish that made everyone smile. Elena wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Jack had traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and his father's pocket watch. As they exchanged vows under the Wyoming sky, with Esperanza and her new foal grazing peacefully in the nearby pasture, Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been purchased as property, had arrived as a refugee, but she was marrying as an equal partner in a love built on mutual respect and understanding. When Jack kissed his bride, Hope clapped her hands in delight, and the sound of their laughter carried across the prairie like a promise that some stories, no matter how they begin, can have truly happy endings.